Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Right before we start, I'd like to ask everyone to put a 1 in the chat. Make sure you can hear me, see the screen. That way we're good to go. All right. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Nemo. Thank you, Lewis. Okay, too many names popping up quickly, but thank you, everyone. All right, it seems we're good to go. All right, well, welcome everyone to another NJThrives Small Business Webinar. These are weekly webinars that the NJSBDC has created to help you start, grow, and thrive with your business. I'm your host, Christian Pichardo, NJSBDC Program Coordinator and Marketing Consultant, as well as CEO at nilomomedia.com. Now, for those of you who don't know, the NJSBDC is a statewide program. We're powered by the SBA and state partners, such as our special guest today, and we help small businesses in New Jersey with 3 things. 1 is no-cost small business consulting. 2 is training and events starting at $0, and exclusive small business resources. That said, our agenda is we go over some small business headlines. After the headlines, we get into the webinar. And after the webinar, we hold a short QA session. So I'd like to welcome on William Spear. He is the manager of the Office of Export Promotion and Project Director for the NJ STEP program at the New Jersey Business Action Center. Hello, can you hear us, William? I know he had some technical difficulties, so let's see if this works here. Give me 1 sec.
Is that working, Christian?
Yep, now we're good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I wanted to start off by saying, Christian and Glorimer, thank you so much for inviting the Business Action Center to participate in this series. It's been a blast to chat with all of you, but it's also been a pleasure to present the Business Action Center to the companies that are participating. I know today we're going to be talking about exporting, and I promise I'm going to get to that in about 20 seconds. But the Business Action Center is embedded within the Department of State, Secretary Way's portfolio in Trenton. And the Business Action Center exists to do many of the things that NJThrives exists to do, and that is to provide no-cost training and exclusive resources for small businesses throughout the state. So you've got things such as our call center, our business helpline, 1-800-JERSEY-7. And I'm not sure if Don Newman's on this today or not, but Don, I promised you last time I would not forget to say that. So 1-800-JERSEY-7 will get you to colleagues of mine who can begin to address questions outside of or even inside of exporting. Then you have the Office of Business Advocacy, the Office of Planning as well. All of these entities exist within the back, which is geared to help companies to grow and to thrive here in the state of New Jersey. Again, very, very similar to NJThrives and what Christian spoke of just a moment ago. Now, with regards to the Office of Export Promotion, which is where I am attached with my colleagues, Gene Chang and Gregory Larkin, we have one very easy to articulate, sometimes difficult to implement, but easily to articulate goal. And that is to grow jobs here in the state through the process of exporting goods and services. And yes, to make the point, services can be exported. And so what our office does is it presents programs, it presents resources, and it encourages companies to at least look past the domestic market in terms of making sales for their products. Now, within our office is the State Trade and Expansion Program, the New Jersey State Trade and Expansion Program. And that is known through its nickname, NJ-STEP. NJ-STEP is a granting program. It provides financial incentives via grants to help companies do select export-related activities. The grants are provided by the federal SBA. We are their grant administrator here in the state of New Jersey, and it can cover activities from the cost to attend a trade show, to internationalizing a website, to translating a product catalog into the language of a foreign buyer or buyers. And this is our 10th year. We've been doing this for 10 years. And so if you're looking at exports, if you're considering exports, we definitely want to have a chance to talk with you, and then also to present to you where it may be applicable. If you say you want to go down a select path, the State Trade Expansion Program, begin talking how that might be a direct resource to defray some of the costs associated with exporting. And I think, Christian, I'm just going to leave it right there. We'll make it short and sweet. I'll be around the entire time and on standby to assist as you or anybody else might request. So that's it from the Business Action Center. Really, really pleased and excited to be here. And Christian, once again, thank you, and handing it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, William. And as you heard here, William's going to be in the chat for any questions regarding the New Jersey Business Action Center and all the wonderful programs that they have going on. So jump into the small business headlines of the week. This week we have 3. So first one here, if it'll load, give me one moment. That's interesting. Taking a little bit longer than usual. Let's try this other link. Okay. All right. We'll start with 2. So NJEDA announces their grant program to support indoor amusement facilities. So this is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you are running a business that is related to indoor amusement, and you may be eligible for up to $150,000 to offset any losses that were incurred during decreased business as a result of that pandemic. So we put these links, by the way, into the chat so you can take them, put them up in another tab, and visit them after the webinar. Now, this second news item here is the New Jersey Pride Chamber of Commerce. They're holding an event over at the American Dream Mall, and this is with Start Out, and it really is just a networking event. I love going to these sort of networking events because not only do you see people that are in line with what you want to do, so that is small business, and you never know really who you're going to meet. Even on these webinars, I encourage everyone to share, what you do, because you'll never know when you'll find your next client, your next partner. So yeah, go ahead and visit this networking event over at the American Dream and get to meet some interesting people. So last one here, a little bit unrelated to small business, but I thought it was so interesting that the NJEDA is seeking investment managers to manage 4 distinct funds. So this is exactly what it sounds like. So if you have any experience in investment management or know someone who does, this might be a great opportunity. And basically it's a combined $150 million of capital that's going to be given to the select managers to support investment in New Jersey through 4 distinct funds. So again, all these links are dropped into the chat. So if you have any questions, you can refer to those. And that's pretty much it for headlines. Now, before we jump into the webinar, 2 things to keep in mind. Please type your questions into the Q&A box So there's a little icon on the bottom of your Zoom window of this screen. It says Q&A. Please put any of your questions there. You can ask anonymously as well. If it's in the chat, we might lose your question because of all the conversations that are happening in there. So yeah, Q&A. And then number 2 is please complete a 3-minute survey. So once this webinar ends, you're going to get redirected automatically. You don't have to do anything. And you'll get redirected to the survey. After you complete that survey, you're going to get access to the presenter's slideshow, and as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Reina. She has been the head captain of the exporting series. So can you tell us a little bit about the series?
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third webinar of a series of 5 that we have started this year to help business owners look into foreign markets. And of course, we had the first session on January 19th, where Bill Spear and myself gave an intro into, what to consider when you start exporting. And of course, the second session was on February 2nd, developing a winning plan for small businesses. This is the export plan tools that we shared. And that was a very exciting presentation. And today we're going to have licensing and compliance for small businesses. And we're going to have David Noah present. He's president of Logistic Solutions, and we are looking at the following 2 will be secure payment and financing for small business exporters in 2 weeks, and the last one will be small business marketing strategies to go global with the U.S. Commercial Service speaker that will be joining us. So I hope that you find all the resources you need to, to explore, plan, and launch your export operations. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm passing it back to you.
For sure. Thank you, Reina. And just for reference, guys, the recordings of any of these previous webinars are available on our YouTube channel and also our website. So we're going to put links into the chat so you can make sure to visit those. But now, for our main guest, I'd like to welcome David Noah, President of Shipping Solutions. He's going to show us or talk about licensing and compliance for small businesses. All right, David, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yep. So I'll just go ahead and start my
sharing.
screen. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Show's yours.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dave Noah, and I am president of Shipping Solutions. I'm going to provide you with an overview of export regulation and documentation today. And here's my contact information, and will also appear on the end of the presentation as well. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. So I'm sorry to say this, but export regulations are complicated. There are more than a dozen agencies that have at least some small role in regulating exports, ranging from the Department of Commerce to the U.S. Postal Service. But while there are all these different agencies, there are 3 sets of regulations that we need to be aware of. It's the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, and the Foreign Trade Regulations, or FTR. Now, the first 2 sets of regulations, EAR and ITAR, regulate the exporting of goods depending on what you are exporting, where you are sending them, who is receiving the items, and how they will be used. We'll talk about these in just a minute. The foreign trade regulations set export reporting requirements so that the trade data can be collected and to help the Bureau of Industry and Security and Customs and Border Protection perform their export oversight role. And I will discuss these regulations a bit later when we talk about export documentation and the automated export system. So export compliance regulations don't just apply to the big guys. I often talk to people who tell me that they don't have to worry about it because they're just a small company, but that's not true. Even the smallest US businesses are subject to a variety of export regulations and can face substantial penalties for violating these rules. Now, unfortunately, for many small and medium-sized businesses, company personnel may not know these requirements until it's too late. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, fines for export violations can reach up to $1 million per violation in criminal cases, while administrative cases can result in penalties amounting to greater than $350,000 or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is higher. In addition, criminal violators may be sentenced to prison for up to 20 years, and administrative penalties may include denial of export privileges. Now, penalties of this size and nature can be especially devastating to small and medium-sized businesses, which of course represent 97% of the approximately 300,000 US companies that export. Small and medium-sized businesses may think they lack the time or money to train personnel in export regulations and the necessity of compliance screening. Even if they do have the necessary experience and training, export personnel may not have the support of senior management, who are also too often unaware of US export regulations. So if your senior management doesn't think you need to worry about export compliance, or if you don't think you need to worry about export compliance, I recommend you download this BIS publication. Don't let this happen to you, which you can see an image of it on the screen. This ebook outlines real-life examples of penalties BIS has recently issued against individuals and businesses who have violated export regulations. And you'll notice that they are businesses of all sizes. So how can you prevent that? Well, companies that export or plan to start exporting need to follow these 7 steps to ensure they comply with export regulations. While these 7 steps are by no means all-inclusive, they give you a good starting point for implementing an export compliance program at your company. So step 1 is properly classify your products. Most exporters are familiar with the harmonized system or Schedule B codes used to classify products for duty and statistical purposes. However, exporters are often less familiar with the classification process required for export control purposes. This starts with determining which US agency has jurisdiction over your products, and then identifying whether there is a classification number that may put restrictions on the export of your goods. The Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, known as BIS, controls the export of most commercial products. Now, while only a small percentage of exports under BIS's jurisdiction require an export license, it's a product's technical characteristics, the destination country, the end user, and a product's end use that factor into this determination. But before you can assume that your products are controlled by BIS, you must make sure that they aren't controlled by the Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Control, or DDTC. These items appear on the US munitions list, or USML, under a specific USML category, or are described in a catch-all paragraph that incorporates specially designed as a control parameter. Now, all items covered by the USML require an export license from the State Department. If your item is not covered anywhere in the USML, the Export Administration Regulation says that export controlled jurisdiction then transfers to the Department of Commerce. So if you determine that your item is not subject to the USML, you can move on to check the Commerce Control List, or CCL, which is the list of export control classification numbers, also known as ECCNs. These classification numbers are for dual use items, meaning they were designed for commercial use, but have the potential to be adapted for weapons or military related use. Now, many seemingly harmless items may be considered dual use, from valves and communications hardware to electrical devices and vehicle parts. So ECCNs are, well, I guess I'm behind the slide. Okay, here you go. ECCNs are 5-character codes, always starting with a number that represent one of the CCL categories. And I've outlined that on the slide here. The second character of an ECCN is always a letter, which represents one of 5 product groups, which again appears on this slide. Now I'm going to use the example of polygraph equipment that has an ECCN of 3A981. The polygraph equipment is found under category 3, which is electronics, and product group A, which is end items, equipment, accessories, attachments, parts, components, and systems. Now it's important to know if any of your products have ECCN classifications, because items with ECCNs may require an export license depending on the destination country. Now there's 3 ways basically to classify your products. First, you can do it yourself following the order of review that we talked about. You can start by determining who has jurisdiction of your products, whether it's the State Department or Commerce Department, and then using the characteristics of your items, determining in which category they fall. BIS has published a free CCL order of review decision tree tool on their website that guides you step by step through the process of self-classifying your products. The link is right here. If you intend to self-classify, you should familiarize yourself with the tool. Now, I went to the website yesterday and the BIS website was down when I was trying to look at it. So I'm assuming it's up to date, but that's the link you would go to see their decision tool. There's also software you can use to help classify your goods under ITAR and EAR. Shipping Solutions, for example, offers a product classification wizard that will help you navigate the process. But even if you use software like this, you still need an understanding of how export controls classification process works. Now, your second option is to ask the manufacturer of the goods for the correct classification. That will only work, of course, if you aren't the manufacturer and if the manufacturer is willing to provide that information. In my experience, many manufacturers don't have the classification code or aren't willing to share it, either because they don't care whether the good is exported, or they don't understand the export regulations themselves, or they aren't willing to commit the time and effort to do the classification for you. Now, your third option for classifying your products is to submit a commodity classification request through BIS's Simplified Network Application Process Redesign, which is also known as SNAP-R. SNAP-R is the same portal you will use if it turns out you need to apply for an export license. So if you submit a CCATS request, as it's referred to in the industry, you need to include the model or part number of your item, the ECCN or ECCNs that you believe apply to your products, enough detail about the specification of your products for BIS to compare your products with the ECCN descriptions, sales literature for your items, plus enough technical detail so they can make an appropriate determination, and justification that your items are subject to the export administration regulations and don't fall under the jurisdiction of the State Department or some other agency. You can include up to 6 items on a single CCATS request. Now, keep in mind that not all items controlled by the Commerce Department have an ECCN classification. If your products aren't in the U.S. munitions list and you can't find them in the Commerce Control List, they're probably EAR 99, which means they are subject to the Export Administration regulations, but are not specifically described by the ECCN, by an ECCN. Now, the tricky part of this determination, of course, is that you can't proactively determine your item is EAR 99 until you make the determination that it doesn't fit into any of the specified ECCN classifications. So, like all aspects of the export compliance process, I recommend you always document how you came to this conclusion. If the Office of Export Enforcement or some other agency comes knocking at your door, you want to be able to demonstrate your company has done its due diligence to do your best to comply. If your product is EAR 99, that doesn't mean there aren't any export restrictions. There are other factors such as the end use and end user of your items that may still require that you get an export license, and we'll discuss those in a little bit. So step 2 is determining if you need an export license. As I mentioned earlier, if your item falls on the U.S. munitions list, you're going to need a license from the State Department. But if they fall under the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department, only a relatively small percentage of U.S. exports and re-exports require a license. BIS license requirements are dependent upon an item's technical characteristics, the destination, the end use, and the end user and the end use of the items. That's why we look through the Commerce Control List to see if your item fell under one of the ECCNs. So in the slide I showed you earlier, I mentioned the ECCN classification of 3A981. This slide shows you the entry for my polygraph equipment under 3A981 that appears on the Commerce Control List, or CCL. So you can see that it's for my polygraph machine. The second section of this entry, labeled license requirements, tells me that the reason my product is controlled is for CC reasons, which means crime control reasons. It also tells me that I should refer to CC column 1 in the commerce country chart. Now, this ECCN entry tells me a lot more, like the fact that there are no license exceptions available. And there are no related controls under the ECCN. Oh, and there are related controls under the ECCN classification of OA982. So you may need to go and refer to that as well. Now, an export license exception is an authorization that allows you to export or re-export items subject to the EAR that would require a license. There are several different license exceptions that exist, and they all have very specific conditions in which they could be used. Now, we could spend an entire 1-hour webinar on export license exceptions, so we don't have time to talk about them today. But I've written a blog post that provides an overview of license exceptions called "What You Need to Know About Export License Exceptions," and I'll give you a link to our blog, my blog, at the end of my slides, and you can look for the "What You Need to Know About Export License Exceptions" blog post. The Bureau of Industry and Security regularly hosts a 2-day seminar called "Complying with U.S. Export Controls," and that walks you through this export license determination process in much more detail. It's a 2-day seminar, so it's a lot more detail than we can do today, and it includes a discussion of the export license exceptions. Now, I recommend that if you do regular exporting, that you should attend this. I've attended it several times. Better yet, several people from your company should go and attend. It's that important. You'll find the current link with the current schedule for this webinar at bis.doc.gov. and then by clicking on the compliance and training link at the top of the page. Anyway, what we're concerned about at the moment is that my polygraph equipment is controlled for crime control reasons, and that means I need to check CC column 1. So here's a page from the Commerce Country Chart. You can see a list of countries listed down the left side of the page in alphabetical order, and a list of reasons for control across the top. And there are several different reasons of control. Now, some of these reasons have multiple columns. Over here for crime control, you'll notice that there are 3 columns: CC1, CC2, CC3. The left one is the most restrictive, the middle one is a little less, and then the third is less restrictive. So let's say that my potential customer for this polygraph equipment is in Honduras. So I find Honduras on the chart. I slide over to CC column 1, and remember, it told me it was controlled for crime control reasons. If there is an X in this box, Honduras and CC1, I need to apply for an export license. And in this case, there is an X. And remember, there are no license exceptions that are available, so I do need to apply for a license. Now, remember, this is just one of the reasons why a license exception may be required. So just to give you an idea how different software may be able to help you is, here's a screenshot from our export control wizard that tells me the same thing by giving me a red light that export license requirements, meaning I need to apply for a license. It would be a green light if no license was required, or a yellow light if it was controlled, but there were license exceptions that were available. Now, we included our same shipment, but said it is going to Cuba. You'll see that I also need to a license for crime control reasons, but it also gives me the additional indication that there is an embargo or sanction against Cuba, and so I have to apply for a license for that reason. Now, Part 746 of the Export Administration Regulation lists all the countries that have been embargoed. So the U.S. has placed general embargoes against Cuba and Syria, for example. It has placed sanctions on selected categories of goods to other countries like Iran and North Korea. And then the U.S. has set sanctions on certain Russian and Belarus industries, for example. So you need to be aware of this. You should be looking at Part 746 to see the updated list of sanctions. As you know, that has changed a lot in the last year with what's happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so these are changing fairly frequently. So step 3 in the export compliance process is to screen all the parties in your export transaction. So in addition to the country or industry sector sanctions, the U.S. has restricted exports to certain individual businesses and other organizations that have been identified as engaging in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, known to be involved in terrorism or drug trafficking, or who have had their export privileges suspended. Now, not all of these individuals or businesses or organizations are foreign. They could be located within the U.S. The Commerce Department maintains the denied persons list, the unverified list, the entity list, and the military end user list, among others. The Treasury Department maintains the specially designated nationals list, the foreign sanctions evaders list, and the sectoral sanctions identification lists, among others. And the State Department has the non-proliferation sanctions and debarred lists. And then other agencies have other miscellaneous lists. There are a couple hundred different lists that the U.S. has. Now, while there is no requirement that companies check every exports against these various restricted party lists, it is a violation of export regulations to export to anyone who appears on any of these lists. Even the smallest exporter should check all the parties in every export transaction against the various restricted party lists to prevent penalties. Now, the U.S. International Trade Administration hosts a consolidated screening list, which allows you to screen against many of these lists, and that list is available for free. In addition, again, companies like Shipping Solutions offer paid subscriptions that provide more comprehensive screening services. Step 4 in your export compliance process is to watch for red flags. As an exporter, you are responsible for knowing how your product is going to be used. Even products that seem harmless can sometimes be used in ways not intended. Some of these end uses are prohibited, while others may require an export license. For example, companies may not export to certain entities involved in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the missiles that deliver them without specific authorization, no matter where these items are. BIS publishes a list of red flags that may be indications that the use of a product may be prohibited. For example, companies should be reasonably suspicious of orders for items that are inconsistent with the needs of the purchaser, a customer who declines installation and testing when included in the sales price or when normally requested, or requests for equipment configurations that are incompatible with the stated destination. All these could be violating US export regulations. So BIS, if you go to that BIS seminar I mentioned, they mentioned the example of a South African businessman who tried ordering several dozen replacement switches for a medical imaging machine. Now, in this case, it's normal to order one replacement switch. It's not normal to order several dozens at one time. So that's a red flag. And it turns out that these switches were going to be used as detonators for nuclear bombs. A red flag may come up at any time, early in an export transaction when you're filling out the requisite paperwork, or when you're finalizing your sales invoices. It's important to be vigilant and pay attention to red flags all the time. If you encounter a red flag, you should refrain from the transaction until an export license application has been submitted to and approved by BIS. Now, don't try to ignore any red flags you may encounter. This is what BIS calls self-blinding. Don't cut off the flow of information. Don't tell potential customers to stop discussing how they are going to use your products. Don't avoid other forms of communication that you would normally receive. This is a case where ignorance is not bliss. Failing to know something you should have known can still get you in a lot of trouble. So step 5, be aware of deemed exports. Now, the export restrictions outlined in the EAR don't just apply to products that have shipped out the country. Raina, you've raised your hand. Did you want to jump in here?
Yes, I'm monitoring the comments in the chat, and I just want you to help me clarify for the audience the licensing. Number one, that and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the license, as mentioned, it applies to the product, to its use, or to the buyer, but it's not a license for the company as exporter. It's not specific that you will have a company and then get an exporting license. That's not the case, right? It is for each product that you sell to the buyer or the country of destination, if it's in an embargo zone, or if it's the use of the product is dual use. So can you please address this question, because there seems to be a little bit of confusion? Thank you. And then I have another one. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, there's no general export license required in the United States. Some other countries do have that requirement, but in the US, there is not a requirement. If you want to be an exporter, you do not have to apply for license. But if your product meets any of those reasons that I've outlined before, if it has an ECCN number, if you look at that commerce country chart and you see that ECCN number reason for control matches your country, remember we had that chart and we went down the crime control column 1, and for Honduras there was an X there, then you need a license. Or if you find out that the end user may be on one of these restricted party lists, then you would need to get a license before you can export the item. If the destination country that you're exporting to appears on that Part 746, that the sanctions and embargoed list, then you would need a license before you can export there as well. So there are very specific reasons that you need a license. You don't need one in general.
Thank you. Thanks. That clarifies a lot for the audience. I have one more clarification. So it is my understanding that, because when people come to me and say, do I need a license? It is my understanding that 95% of the time you might not need a license, because it sounds like everything you're gonna send out or wherever you're gonna send it to might need a license. So is this right, or am I wrong with my this assessment that 95% are not really required or subject to licensing?
I don't know if the 95% is the exact percentage, but most items definitely do not need a license. But you should not make the assumption that because your product sounds very simple or it doesn't sound dangerous at all, an item may need a license if it's considered to be dual use, meaning it's created for commercial purposes, but could be used for something more nefarious than that. But that includes some parts that could be used within that more dangerous item or something like that. So it's dangerous for companies to assume that because they think they make a very simple product that they are exempt from a license. Most products don't need a license, but it's dangerous to make the assumption that you do. Now, if you're growing grain and you're exporting that to Canada or somewhere, that's a pretty safe assumption. But even that can be used for making bombs or things like that. So there are things that these are things that you need to be aware of, and you should at least do some check, and most importantly, document that you're doing that. Being able to prove that you've done due diligence. If something goes wrong, you want to be able to document that you understand you had an obligation under the regulations and that you did your best effort to comply with those regulations. And that can make a world of difference in the amount of penalties that are maybe assessed against you.
Thanks for clarifying. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
That's
Thank
it
you.
from my side. Carry
Okay.
on. Thanks.
Okay, so now that's what we're talking about. There is shipping products. What we talked about is shipping a physical product somewhere else. So now you also need to be aware of what's called deemed exports, and that's step 5 of this. So these export regulations that I'm talking about don't just apply to products being shipped outside the United States. Companies are exporting technology in many ways, by sharing technical data, such as plans and blueprints of products, or by allowing visual inspections of a product to a foreign national within the United States. This is called a deemed export, and it requires that companies follow the same steps we're discussing today, just as if they were physically shipping the goods internationally. So a foreign national is not someone who is a U.S. citizen, not a permanent resident, or not in the U.S. under specific refugee status. In a sense, the foreign person is considered to be the embodiment of his or her country of citizenship. So the essence of this deemed export rule is that providing technology to a foreign person is the same as exporting it to that person's country of citizenship, regardless of where the parties are located when the technology is provided. So, for example, if I was to provide a Honduran citizen in Minneapolis with controlled technology for my polygraph equipment, this is considered to be an export of that technology to Honduras. And as we went through that example earlier, that requires an export license. So step 6 of the compliance process is to document what you've done, as I mentioned just a little bit ago. what good is it to put all this effort into staying compliant if you can't prove that you've done so? When you classify your products, document when you did so and how you made the decisions you made. When you check to see if an export license was required, document that process. Excuse me. Keep copies of all the restricted party screenings that you've done. As an exporter, you are required to maintain copies of all your export documents for a minimum of 5 years. Although keep in mind that certain agencies and departments start that clock ticking at different points. In addition to the standard export forms, you need to include any export control documents, memoranda, notes, correspondence, contracts, invitations to bid, books of account, finance records, restrictive trade practices or boycott requests, notifications from BIS, and any other documents pertaining to the transactions not specifically exempt from these record-keeping requirements. In the case of an export compliance audit, you must be able to find all the pertinent documents related to any export transaction from the last 5 years. The Office of Export Enforcement will not make an exception just because you've stored older files in a facility 300 miles away. In fact, doing so will only illustrate that you're ignoring best practices. Now, when small and medium-sized businesses become aware of their legal obligations as exporters, including this document retention requirement, they sometimes try to avoid the responsibilities of export compliance by hiring a freight forwarder or other party to handle their exports. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with outsourcing the export functions. That's a best practice for many companies, but they must realize that you can't outsource your liability. You can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource liabilities. Companies that hire third parties to manage their exports should require documentation that all export regulations are being followed, and they should retain copies of this documentation on site for at least 5 years. This documentation can be used to demonstrate compliance with the EAR, or if some violations are found by the US government, be used as evidence of a good faith effort to comply, which could result in reduced penalties. So step 7 of the compliance procedures is to implement these compliant procedures. In this short time, and even with this high-level review of export compliance procedures, we've talked about a lot of different things that an exporter needs to know, and a lot of different things they need to keep track of. I get asked all the time, how are we supposed to do this? And that's where a written export compliance program comes into play. According to BIS, an ECP, or an export compliance program, analyzes pieces of information and individual decisions and builds them into an organized, integrated system. It is a program that can be established to manage export-related decisions and transactions to ensure compliance with the EAR. Now, most exporters never plan on doing something wrong. However, mistakes can happen, and the consequences can be significant. Companies can face fines, lose their export privileges, and in the most egregious cases, see people go to jail. A properly implemented ECP will help alleviate that risk. Now, a comprehensive ECP gives you a clear plan of how to audit your company's procedures and processes yourself, so you can identify and address any potential violations before they even surface. A well-written ECP can substantially reduce penalties if your company violates export regulations, as long as you can document that you regularly followed the written ECP procedures. The BIS considers that a strong mitigating factor when determining penalties. According to BIS, an effective ECP includes 8 elements: a management commitment, continuous risk assessment of the export program, written export authorization procedures for determining jurisdiction, classification, licensing, and screening, all that stuff that we've talked about today, clear record-keeping responsibilities, ongoing training of all employees, including support staff involved in exporting, regular audits of the export compliance program to ensure it is still being followed, a program for handling compliance problems, including reporting export violations, and scheduled reviews, maintenance, and updates of the written ECP as changes warrant. Creating an export compliance program can be a lot of work, but as the old management statement says, prior planning can prevent poor performance. So I have in here several potential export violations and the way to review those or how to solve them. So we'll go quickly through this list just as kind of a review of what we've talked about so far. So violation number 1 is exporting controlled products without an export license. The solution is simple: properly classify your products with the correct USML or ECCN code and determine if the destination country requires a license. The second one is exporting to an embargoed country without an export license. This is where you need to check Part 746 of the EAR for the most up-to-date list of embargoed countries like Cuba, Iran, and Syria. Violation 3, exporting to individuals, organizations, or companies on one or more of the U.S. government's bad guy list. This is where you need to do your restricted party or denied party screening to check your parties in the transaction against these lists. And if you get a match, you shouldn't export without getting a license. Violation 4 is exporting a product that ends up in the used in support of illegal activities. So I think we've all seen the news recently where some of the drones that the Ukraine military has shot down that came from Russia had several components from US companies. And there is an investigation going on to see how US parts were used in these military drones. And so those companies are going to have a lot of explaining to do. So this is where you need to watch for red flags. You need to know how your products are going to be used. Sharing controlled technologies with foreign nationals in the US without a license. Again, this is a deemed export. So you want to identify those items and technologies that are controlled for exports to certain countries. You have to identify employees, interns, and visitors from those specific countries and restrict access to those items. So a visitor log program is very important. Pre-screening visitors to your facility is important if you have controlled items. And then you want to make sure you screen them against those various bad guy lists. So those are kind of the licensing regulation requirements under the government regulations. I'm going to do a quick overview of the standard documents that are required for exporting. And we'll go through this quicker than we did the licensing part. This is definitely normally something I spend an hour talking about as well, but I'm not going to spend an hour going through this today. But so these are the standard export documents that are required when you're shipping your goods. And we're going to go through these quickly so you have an understanding of what those documents may be. So if you get an inquiry from a domestic products, you probably would use a quotation, but in an international transaction, your quote would typically be provided in the form of a pro forma invoice. They may need, and that's because the potential customer may need a pro forma invoice to arrange for financing, to open a letter of credit, to apply for the proper import licenses, and to determine what else they need to do to import your goods. So as you can see, it looks a lot like a commercial invoice. It just doesn't have all the information that may appear on the commercial invoice. But it identifies who the buyer and seller of the transaction is, a detailed description of the goods, the harmonized system classification or Schedule B code of the product, the price, and the term of the sale. which would typically be one of the 11 current Incoterms. The payment terms, the delivery details, and how much it will cost and what currency will be used, whether it's US dollars or some other currency. Now, it's very important that you always have an expiration date on your pro forma invoice. Things change in international trade. We've seen the fluctuation in cost of shipping, so you don't want to be using outdated pricing for shipping, for example, for your pro forma invoice. Now, there's a difference between harmonized system, harmonized tariff schedule, and Schedule B codes. I don't have time to go into real detail here about what those are, but basically a harmonized system code is 6 digits long. It's published by the World's Customs Organization. It's the basis of which most countries use to develop their own longer codes. So within the US, that's the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, or HTS, of the US, and that is administered by the International Trade Commission. That's typically 10 digits long, and it's required for imports. On the export side, the Census Bureau's Foreign Trade Division uses those HS codes to come up with their own 10-digit codes, which is really a subset of the HTS codes, and it's used for exports. So for internal import and export purposes, you need to use the 10-digit code, but when you're creating a commercial invoice or pro forma invoice, you would use the 6-digit code, because that code should be the same in every country. So then the second document is the commercial invoice, and the commercial invoice, probably the most important document that is included with the shipment. It has all the information that we mentioned on the commercial invoice, plus additional information because you have finalized the information. So the commercial invoice is going to look a lot like that pro forma invoice. It now has additional details. You probably didn't have an order number before, or some other customer reference number. You may have added additional banking and payment information. You need to make sure to include any relevant insurance information and include any other details that will ensure prompt delivery of your goods. Now, it also needs to include the destination control statement. So this commercial invoice helps you stay compliant with US export regulations. If any of the goods in your shipment require an export license or are eligible for an export license exception, things we talked about a bit earlier, you need to include the destination control statement on your invoice. The statement is intended to ensure that your buyer understands that the goods in this shipment are intended for the country listed on the invoice, and they shouldn't be diverted to another country. They shouldn't end up in Iran, where they're put into drones that are then shipped to Russia, which are used in the military action against Ukraine. Now, although you only need to include this statement on the commercial invoice for those items that are controlled for export purposes, I recommend that you include this statement on all your export invoices. In fact, I know a lot of companies that include this statement on their domestic invoices as well. If you order a new laptop computer from Dell, their invoice includes this statement regardless of where you are located. Now, there are other versions of the commercial invoice depending on where you're shipping. Canada Customs Invoice is used for shipments valued at more than $2,500, unless your standard invoice has all the extra details that they require. And then, for example, the CARICOM countries, the Caribbean Community countries, have a version of the invoice as well. The next document is the packing list. It may be more detailed than a packing list or packing slip you provide for your domestic shipments. Your freight forwarder will use this information to create the bills of lading for the shipment. A bank may require that a detailed packing list be included in a set of documents you present under a letter of credit. And US customs officials in the US and the destination countries appreciate a packing list because they identify any items where they're packed if they want to check those items. It's better that they know precisely which crate to go to rather than open them all up. So those are the documents required for that. Now, some countries like China and certain Middle Eastern countries require a certificate of origin for your shipments that identify in what countries the goods have originated. These certificates of origin usually need to be signed by some semi-official organization like a Chamber of Commerce or a country's consulate office. This certificate of origin may be required even if you've included the country of origin information on your commercial invoice. Usually a Chamber of Commerce will charge you a fee to stamp and sign your certificate or require you to be a member of that chamber. You'll need to deliver a completed form to the chamber where they will stamp and sign it. Now, since COVID happened and as we're coming out of COVID, we've seen an increase in the number of electronic certificates of origin where you can apply for a certificate of origin that is chamberized through a Chamber of Commerce online and it's electronically delivered to you. And that's something that we're seeing happen more and more. We offer that service through our Shipping Solutions website as well. In addition to that generic certificate of origin, we have a free trade agreement certificates of origin. There are country-specific ones. We have U.S. has free trade agreements with all these countries here, including the USMCA, U.S.-Mexico, Canada agreement, which is probably the most popular used one. So there may be certificates of origin that are required as well. And that may be something you need to fill out. Here are the key elements that you need to know. You should not fill out a certificate of origin, a free trade agreement certificate of origin, unless you know that your goods qualify. There are specific rules that are identified when your goods qualify under the free trade agreement certificate of origin. So make sure that you know for a fact that your goods qualify before you sign a certificate. Sometimes a customer will request that you fill out and sign the form. And I talk to people all the time and get that request. And you're basically committing fraud if you do that. So you should not be doing that. Another potential document that you may need to fill out is the certificate of free sale. So certain countries may require a certificate of free sale for certain types of products, particularly things that are ingested or that can be applied to the skin. If a country wants to make sure that an item is safe, they may want proof that the good can be used. It can be legally sold within the United States. And so if you can provide documentation that you can legally sell the product in the United States, then they make the assumption that it is safe and that they can import it into their country. And so you may need a certificate of free sale. Now, shipper's letter of instruction is probably the most important document. It's basically a cover memo that provides instructions to the freight forwarder on how to handle your shipment, the items that are included in your shipment. It may include a limited power of attorney, giving your freight forwarder the ability to act on your behalf, including filing the electronic export information through the automated export system, which I mentioned a little earlier. In fact, if you're going to be doing that, there is a version of the shipper's letter of instruction that is published by the National Customs Broker and Forwarding Association of America that they recommend that you use, that includes all the data elements that they need to file through AES. So what is AES? So this is the last of the third set of U.S. trade regulations that I wanted to discuss, the foreign trade regulations. This is administered by the Census Bureau. It defines the export reporting requirements through AES. It defines the various parties in an export transaction. So under the foreign trade regulation, there is no exporter. There's the U.S. principal party of interest. There is no importer. There's the foreign principal party in interest. The FTR is also where the Schedule B codes are defined. And all of these regulations are administered by the enforcement arms of BIS and CBP. Now, according to the foreign trade regulations, most exports valued at more than $2,500 per item must be submitted to the Census Bureau through AES. Now, that's a very broad explanation of the AES filing requirements. There are some exceptions to that. There are some additions to that, but as a general rule, if your items being shipped are valued at $2,500 per Schedule B code, that you must file. Now, I've written so many blog posts about AES filing requirements. We can't cover it here today. Again, if you go to shippingsolutions.com/blog, we have a whole section related specifically to the automated export system. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that during the Q&A period. So, most companies rely on the freight forwarder to do their AES filing on their behalf, and that's where you would use that shipper's letter of instruction. However, I think that, and I always recommend that companies should do their own AES filing, because you know your products best. This way you are aware that the information is being filed correctly. It's not that hard to do the AES filing. If you've properly prepared your export documents, you're going to have the information that you need to do so. So I recommend that companies do it themselves. As I said before, you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource liability. So I would do that myself. So those are the 6 most common export documents. There are other export documents that you may be asked to fill out. It could be an inland bill of lading, an ocean bill of lading, an airway bill, the dangerous goods forms. If your items are considered dangerous goods, you may have to fill out an IATA and IMO dangerous goods form. To get paid under a letter of credit or a documentary collection, you may have to fill out a bank draft. That's another document you may need to fill out. So export documents are important, and it should not be something that you worry about when you're ready to ship the product. It should not be an afterthought. You should include discussion of your documentation requirements up front during the sales negotiation. What documents are required? Who's going to prepare those documents? How do they need to prepare? What kind of information needs to appear on those documents? This is all should be part of the discussion up front. The worst thing that can happen, and where so many companies get into trouble, particularly if they have something like a letter of credit that they're using as a payment, is if you don't have your documentation figured out ahead of time, it can delay your shipments, and you may default on your letter of credit and not be able to meet the terms of that letter of credit. So make sure that you talk about and figure out the documentation requirements up front as you're making the sale. So I talked about a lot of stuff today, and I went a little long. Apologize for that. We have some additional resources here from the government websites. I know you're going to get the copies of these slides. So there's a link to all those for the government trade regulations. And then in addition, I mentioned several resources on our website where you can find more information as well. I have links for there. Here's my email address, daven@shipsolution. Here's my phone number. I'm happy to talk with anyone. I'm happy to answer any questions that we have time to answer today, but I'm also happy to talk to anyone after the fact and provide any information that I can. So that's it. That's my presentation, and I will stop sharing right now.
Awesome.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
presentation, David. Thank you. And thank you, Reina, as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I think we got 5 minutes. Can we give the people some 5 minutes for Q&A?
Yeah, we have some questions unanswered in the Q&A, so I guess we'll address the ones that we can, right?
Perfect. All right. So first question I see is from Anonymous. I believe this is reference to something. It just says, meaning that the product was manufactured in another country, but I would sell it as an American product. I've heard the percentage of the product must be assembled in the USA.
If if an item is of US origin, if it is an item that is manufactured in another country, but it includes US parts, if it uses US technology to build that, even if it's in another country, unless it qualifies under the de minimis rule, which I believe is 20%, it has fewer than 20% parts from the US, then all these export licensing and other requirements apply.
Perfect. Next question here is from Manuel. He asks, what would happen if regulations of a particular commodity change after shipment has been made?
That's why you want to document all this information so that you can show that as of this date, when you ship this product, you complied with the regulations.
Right, we have a question from Wiss. Question is, foreign clients often ask for quotes / pricing for items. However, a lot of factors impact pricing, such as country of destination, volume, etc. Any suggestions of a template that U.S. firms can use when providing quotes to foreign clients?
Well, the pro forma invoice is often what companies use instead of the traditional quote form quotation, because it has all those details included on it, shipping charges, freight charges, depending on what Incoterm you use to go negotiate the sale, who's responsible for paying for the duties and taxes, and who's paying for what transportation up to what point. All that should be listed on your pro forma invoice. So I would use that, and I would make sure to put an expiration date on that pro forma invoice as well, because as you mentioned, things change.
I have a question from Anonymous here. Where can I find information on licensed custom agents for New Jersey? And I believe Raina, you requested to answer that.
Yeah, I put the link in the chat. I wasn't able to insert it in the in the Q&A. So I have a list, the link to the list of approved. You can actually search there by state. In the chat, you can find the link, okay?
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Raina. So you heard it here, everyone. The list is inside the chat, so you don't have to do any work anymore. Great. And I have one last question. It seems that we have 3 minutes for this one. Chamber of Commerce in Canada issues certificate of origin. They're generally accepted, but the question is, certificate of origin issued by Chamber of Commerce represent a risk for any given shipment of commercial goods?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay.
A certificate of origin has to be issued by a chamber or signed by a chamber in the country in which the goods have a connection. So a Canadian Chamber of Commerce issuing a certificate of origin, if the goods were manufactured in Canada or being exported from Canada, that would work. But if the goods are manufactured in the US and being exported from the US, you would need to get a certificate of origin stamped by a US based chamber.
Great, great. I think that might have answered the question, Manuel. If you have some context to the question, please add it here. But that seems to be it. No, he says, thanks, I'm good. All right. So that was all questions. Yep, we reached everything. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you again, David, for joining us. And by the way, everyone, he's on vacation and he's doing work still. Someone tell him to take a real vacation. Awesome. So really appreciate everyone's time here. David, Raina, and whoever made it here. For our upcoming
Thanks,
webinars. Yeah, absolutely. William, you as well. Thank you for joining. I didn't know you were still here.
Oh, yes, sir.
Awesome. Thank you for sticking along. So for next week, everyone, is our part of our tech series. So if you are an innovative company, you have some type of invention or something like that. Part of our tech series next week is a first, and we're going to show you how to choose the right agency as it pertains to SBIR and STTR grants, which are federal grants that are given to tech-based companies for inventions, basically innovations, if you will. So that's next week. If you're looking to attend this event, you can go ahead and scan the QR code there, or you can visit njsbdc.com/events. So that is all for us today. We are the NJSBDC. We helped over 15,000 plus small businesses. And remember, you can get no cost business consulting, training and events like this one starting at $0 and exclusive resources. Go ahead and visit njsbdc.com to get started. And that is all. I hope to see everyone next week. And if you have any questions, you can actually submit them to events@njsbdc.com. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And until next time, bye, everyone.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. Goodbye.